They say the badge is a symbol of honor, a promise to protect and serve. But what happens when the weight of that badge becomes something else entirely? For Officer Brooke Harrington, it wasn't a single moment that unraveled her world. It was the slow realization that she had failed the very people she was sworn to protect. It all began with a routine call on an ordinary afternoon. A young man standing outside a corner store, waiting for his sister. But in Brooke's eyes, shaped by years of subtle conditioning, Justin Matthews became something else, a problem to control, rather than a person to understand. The arrest that followed wasn't just a mistake, it was a flashpoint that sent shockwaves through the community, igniting a firestorm of questions about power, prejudice, and accountability. As public outrage grew and the truth came to light, Brooke's career, reputation, and sense of self crumbled beneath the weight of her actions. But in the ashes of her fall, an unexpected journey began, a journey not just toward redemption, but toward something deeper. The courage to listen, to learn, and to make things right. Faced with the fallout of her mistakes, Brooke must choose whether to hide behind excuses or confront the painful truth. Will she find the strength to stand before the very people she wronged and work to rebuild what was broken? And will the community she once failed ever see her as more than the sum of her worst moment? The morning sun crept through the slatted blinds of Brooke Harrington's small apartment, casting narrow beams across the simple but tidy living room. The soft hum of the city outside was just beginning. Commuters rushing to the station, the distant thrum of buses making their rounds. Brooke stood in front of the mirror in her cramped bathroom, adjusting the navy blue uniform she had spent years dreaming of wearing. Her silver badge caught the light, and a flicker of pride warmed her chest. "Today is the day," she murmured, tightening her hair into a precise bun. Brooke was a fresh graduate from the academy, new to the Lexington Police Department, but determined to prove herself. She had grown up in a small, rural town where respect for law enforcement was almost second nature. Her father, a retired officer, used to say, "Wear the badge right, and people will respect you." She clung to that advice as she grabbed her keys and headed out the door. The precinct was a bustling hive of activity as Brooke stepped in, her polished boots clicking on the tile floor. She nodded confidently at her colleagues, some giving her a cursory glance of acknowledgement, others barely noticing her at all. She was the new recruit, invisible until proven worthy. "First solo patrol, Harrington." Sergeant Grant Foster greeted her near the coffee machine. Foster was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with a reputation for being fair, but firm. He handed her a clipboard with the day's assignments. "Yes, sir," Brooke answered, standing straighter. "Remember, the job is not just about enforcement," Foster added, eyeing her carefully. "It is about understanding people." Brooke nodded, but in her mind, she was ready to show her capability. She did not want to seem soft. She wanted to prove that she could handle the streets. By midday, Brooke had handled a few minors' calls, a shoplifting incident at a convenience store, a parking violation, and a noise complaint that was resolved with little fuss. She felt the day was going smoothly. She cruised down 4th Street when the radio crackled. "Suspicious person reported near the corner of 4th and Maple. Possible loitering near the store entrance." Brooke picked up the radio. "Unit 23 responding. ETA 2 minutes." She pulled up to the scene and saw a young black man standing near the entrance of the corner grocery store. He was dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt and was checking his phone. Brooke scanned the area, remembering her academy training. The call was vague, but she had been taught that it was better to be cautious than complacent. She stepped out of her patrol car, resting her hand on her utility belt. "Sir," she called out, approaching. The man looked up, surprised, but calm. "Yes, officer?" "We got a call about suspicious activity. What are you doing here?" He blinked, confused. "Waiting for my sister. She works at the dental clinic next door. We meet for lunch every Thursday." Brooke frowned. He seemed polite, collected, but there was something in his calmness that irked her. Compliance, in her mind, should look nervous, not composed. "I need to see some ID," Brooke said firmly. The man's brow furrowed slightly. "May I ask why?" "I am just standing here." Her tone sharpened. "Are you refusing a lawful order?" The man, whose name was Justin Matthews, slowly reached for his wallet. "No, I am not refusing. I am just asking why." Brooke stepped closer, feeling her heartbeat quicken. A small crowd had gathered. Some had their phones out, recording. She felt the pressure mount as the tension thickened. "I said, hands where I can see them." Justin held his hands out, wallet still visible, but Brooke interpreted his movement as defiance. Moments later, Justin was in handcuffs, his phone clattering to the ground as onlookers gasped. "Wait, that is my brother!" a voice cried out. Brooke turned to see a young woman in scrubs rushing from the dental clinic, her face stricken. "He was waiting for me." But Brooke had already called for backup and was leading Justin to the patrol car. The scene was captured by several phones, the footage spreading quickly across social media. Back at the station, Brooke filled out her report with careful wording, framing Justin as uncooperative. She convinced herself that she had acted within protocol. She was keeping the city safe, doing her job. As she submitted the report, she felt a pang of something guilt, maybe, but she pushed it aside. Across town, Angela Matthews, Justin's mother, sat at her dining room table, trembling as her daughter explained what had happened. Angela immediately called Marcus Walker, a civil rights attorney known for fighting police misconduct. Her heart was heavy, but she was determined to fight for her son's dignity. The following morning, Brooke's commanding officer, Lieutenant Rachel Monroe, called her into the office. The normally warm lieutenant had a somber expression as she handed Brooke a file. "Brooke, Judge Daniels is presiding over this case," Monroe said. "He is not the kind of judge who lets things slide. You need to understand what you are stepping into." Brooke stiffened. "I followed the report template. I followed the rules." Monroe sighed. "Following the rules does not mean you are right. The truth has a way of coming to light." Later that afternoon, Brooke checked her phone and saw the footage. The shaky recording showed Justin reaching slowly for his wallet, clearly stating his actions. The comments underneath was harsh, accusing her of profiling, of escalating a peaceful situation. Brooke stared at the screen, her stomach sinking. As she sat alone in her small apartment that night, the city lights glowing outside her window, doubt began to seep in. The uniform she had once admired now felt heavy. In the Matthews home, Justin sat quietly as his mother wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "We are going to fight this," she said firmly. "You deserve justice." Brooke had no idea that her first solo arrest would become the defining moment of her life, a storm that would force her to confront not just the system she served, but the person she was becoming. The courthouse was packed that Monday morning, the air thick with anticipation and tension. Brooke Harrington arrived early, determined to project confidence despite the storm of online outrage surrounding her arrest of Justin Matthews. Her uniform was pristine, her badge polished to a high shine, but her mind felt anything but clear. As she stepped up the marble stairs, reporters shouted questions. Their camera flashes flickered like lightning, illuminating the uncertainty she fought to bury. Brooke kept walking, head high, but the weight of their words clung to her like static. Inside Courtroom 3B, Judge Everett Daniels adjusted the sleeves of his black robe before taking his seat. The crowd rose as the bailiff called, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Daniels." Everett Daniels commanded the room not with loud proclamations, but with a quiet, resolute presence. He had spent decades building his reputation for fairness and unwavering commitment to justice. But to Brooke, he was more than just a judge, he was an obstacle. Brooke took her place at the prosecution's table, glancing at the defense side where Justin Matthews sat with his attorney, Marcus Walker. Justin's mother, Angela, sat directly behind him, her face calm but resolute. Marcus Walker stood and spoke with practiced precision. Your Honor, we request that all charges against my client be dismissed immediately on the grounds of false arrest and misconduct. The request hung in the air, and Brooke's heart thudded. She forced herself to meet Judge Daniels's gaze, determined not to look away. Daniels nodded. Mr. Walker, your motion is noted. We will review all evidence before proceeding. He turned his steady gaze to Brooke. Officer Harrington, are you prepared to testify today? Yes, Your Honor, Brooke answered. Her voice was steady, but her palms were damp with sweat. The first piece of evidence presented was the bystander footage, grainy but damning. The court watched in silence as the video played. Justin Matthews stood by the store, calmly scrolling through his phone. Brooke's approach was clipped and direct. The courtroom watched as Justin visibly reached for his wallet and announced his intention. In her mind, Brooke had replayed this scene a dozen times, but seeing it through the eyes of the courtroom was different. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the tension thickened as people processed what they saw. She glanced toward Marcus Walker, who stood impassively, arms folded. Judge Daniels leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. Officer Harrington, based on the footage, it appears Mr. Matthews was cooperative. Can you explain why you perceived him as a threat? Brooke's throat felt dry, but she forced herself to respond. Your Honor, I responded to a call about suspicious behavior. I acted according to training. Daniels held up a hand. I am not asking for department procedure. I am asking about your judgment. His words landed heavily. Brooke paused. He was calm in a way that felt unusual for someone being questioned. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus Walker stood. Your Honor, is it a crime to be calm during a police interaction? Daniels gave him a sharp glance. We are here for the facts, Mr. Walker. Stay on course. He turned back to Brooke. Officer Harrington, calm is not a reasonable basis for escalation. Did you consider any other explanations for his behavior? Brooke's silence was answer enough. Justin Matthews was called to the stand next. His steady voice filled the room as he recounted the day of the arrest. I was waiting for my sister, as I do every Thursday. When Officer Harrington approached, I felt surprised, not afraid. I thought if I spoke respectfully and explained myself, everything would be fine. Brooke's stomach tightened as she listened. He wasn't defiant or accusatory, just honest. Marcus Walker leaned forward. And were you given a chance to explain? No, Justin said simply. By the time my sister came out of the clinic, I was already in handcuffs. Angela Matthews wiped her eyes as her son spoke, but she sat straight, refusing to let her grief show as weakness. When Justin stepped down, Marcus addressed the court again. We are not here to villainize Officer Harrington. We are here because my client was treated as guilty before he had a chance to be heard. Judge Daniels steepled his fingers. This case raises serious concerns about the assumptions we carry in uniform. I am ordering an independent investigation into Officer Harrington's arrest report and training history. The words hit Brooke harder than she expected. She had believed the worst was behind her, but this was only the beginning. As the courtroom emptied, Brooke noticed Sergeant Grant Foster standing in the back, arms crossed. He caught her eye and gave a small nod, but his face was grim. Later, in the hallway, Marcus Walker and Angela Matthews passed Brooke. Angela stopped for a moment and met Brooke's eyes. I want you to know, Angela said softly, I am not just fighting for my son. I am fighting for every mother who worries that her child will not come home. Think carefully about what kind of officer you want to be. Brooke swallowed hard as they walked away. Her mind felt like a maze of tangled thoughts. She had never thought of herself as part of a problem, only someone enforcing the law. But those words stayed with her as she drove home, the city lights blurring outside her window. That night, her small apartment felt claustrophobic. She sank onto the couch, scrolling through the day's news. Headlines about the trial filled the screen. Her name was there too, in stories questioning her integrity, her decisions, her character. She thought about her father's words. Wear the badge right, and people will respect you. Respect. What did that even mean anymore? As she stared at the ceiling, memories of the courtroom replayed in her mind. Justin's steady voice, Angela's fierce grace, Judge Daniel's calm authority. The truth was dawning on her in ways she had not expected. This was not just a courtroom battle. This was the start of something bigger, something that would test everything she thought she knew. In the darkness, Brooke whispered to herself the question that had been forming in her mind all day. What if I was wrong? The next morning, Brooke Harrington sat at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee growing cold in front of her. The news coverage from the previous day's court session played on her phone, the commentators' voices low but sharp. Is Officer Brooke Harrington an example of systemic failure or an isolated mistake? One anchor asked. Brooke muted the video. The word mistake hung in the air like a cloud over her head. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a message from her father. Stay strong. Do your job and tell the truth. She stared at the words for a long moment before slipping her phone into her pocket. But what was the truth? The doubts that had crept in during the court session were now swirling inside her, louder than ever. By the time she reached the precinct, the air inside felt different. Conversations quieted as she walked by. Colleagues who normally greeted her with casual nods suddenly avoided her gaze. She could feel their unspoken judgment, their unease at the attention she had brought to the department. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe called her into the office. Monroe's calm, level voice greeted her, but her eyes were sharp. Close the door. Brooke sat down, trying to steady her breathing. Monroe folded her hands on the desk. I will be straight with you. This investigation is not going away. The footage, the arrest report, the witness accounts, it is all adding up to something you need to reckon with. I wrote what I saw, Brooke said defensively. Monroe sighed. Did you write what you thought people expected to see? Brooke's heart sank. She thought back to the moment in the report when she described Justin as erratic. The truth was, he had not been erratic at all. He had been calm. Too calm, she thought at the time. But now, that seemed like a flimsy excuse. Look, Brooke, Monroe continued, her voice softer now. I get it. You wanted to prove yourself. But part of wearing this badge means admitting when you get it wrong. Brooke opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Monroe's gaze held steady. Think about how you want this story to end. The morning's assignments were posted on the board, but Brooke's name wasn't listed. Instead, Sergeant Grant Foster caught her on her way to the break room. Harrington, he said quietly, come with me. Brooke followed him down the hallway, past the main bullpen, to a quieter room away from the usual foot traffic. Foster closed the door and leaned against the wall. I wanted you to hear this from me, Foster said, his tone heavy. You're on administrative leave until the investigation wraps up. The words hit Brooke like a punch to the gut. Administrative leave? Foster nodded. You need to step back while they review everything, your reports, your training history. It is standard. But that makes me look guilty, Brooke said, her voice barely above a whisper. Foster crossed his arms. What makes you look guilty is refusing to reflect on what happened. Do you think being defensive will make this easier? It won't. Brooke blinked hard, willing herself not to cry. Foster's voice softened. I have been where you are, made decisions I was sure were right, only to learn the hard way that they weren't. The question is, what are you going to do with that? The silence of her apartment was unbearable when she returned home that afternoon. She paced the small living room, replaying every detail of the arrest in her mind. She kept hearing Justin's voice steady, respectful, and she kept hearing Angela Matthews's quiet but cutting words. Think carefully about what kind of officer you want to be. Brooke felt the walls closing in. Needing air, she grabbed her coat and walked out into the brisk afternoon. The streets were busy, people heading home from work, others chatting on phone calls. She walked aimlessly until she reached an old neighborhood diner she had not visited in years. The sign flickered slightly, but the cozy interior felt warm and familiar. The smell of fresh coffee and grilled food greeted her as she stepped inside. The waitress behind the counter, an older woman with kind eyes, greeted her. "Sit anywhere you like, hun." Brooke chose a small booth by the window. She barely noticed when the waitress returned with a mug of coffee and set it in front of her. "Long day?" the waitress asked, her voice gentle. Brooke hesitated but nodded. "Something like that." The waitress gave her a sympathetic look. "Whatever it is, it'll pass. You just have to figure out what you want to do when the dust settles." Brooke watched her walk away, her words lingering. When the dust settles? But what if everything was destroyed when it did? As she sipped the coffee, the door chimed, and a group of young men entered, filling the diner with laughter. Brooke glanced up and recognized one of them, Justin Matthews's younger cousin, Devin. He was a college student known for organizing community events. Devin noticed her and froze, the laughter on his face fading. His friends glanced at him, puzzled. Devin approached her table slowly, cautious but curious. "Officer Harrington," he said evenly. Brooke straightened. "Devin, She hesitated. What could she say to someone connected to the man she had humiliated in public? Devin studied her for a moment. "You're not here to cause trouble, right?" Brooke shook her head. "No, I'm just trying to figure things out." Devin's expression softened just slightly. "Good," he said, "because this city's had enough trouble." He started to walk away but paused. "You know, my cousin Justin never wanted this. All he wanted was lunch with his sister. You took that moment from him." Brooke felt the weight of his words like a stone in her chest. She watched Devin rejoin his friends, their laughter resuming but quieter now. The coffee in front of her had gone lukewarm, but Brooke stayed for a long time, staring out the window. By the time she returned home, the sun had set, and the city lights cast long, glowing shadows. She sat down on the couch, finally letting the ache in her chest rise. Brooke had always thought respect came from control, from projecting authority. But today, she had seen how hollow that belief had become. The cracks in her shield of confidence were widening. For the first time, she realized the badge she wore was not enough to protect her from the truth. The truth was simple and terrifying. She had been wrong. The next morning, Brooke Harrington woke up to the soft patter of rain against her window. The gray sky matched the heaviness in her heart. The events of the last few days had chipped away at her confidence, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling as the thoughts replayed. The courtroom, Justin's voice, Devin's words. Eventually, she forced herself up and made her way to the kitchen. She filled her mug with coffee but barely tasted it. The quiet felt suffocating again. The usual rhythm of her life had vanished, replaced by doubt and isolation. By late morning, her phone buzzed with a message from the department. Mandatory meeting with Judge Daniels. 2 p.m., Courtroom 3B. Brooke's stomach twisted. She could guess what the meeting was about. She knew how Judge Daniels operated. He was known for digging beneath the surface. He was not one for theatrics or grand speeches, but his decisions carried weight that stayed with people long after they left his courtroom. She arrived at the courthouse early, making her way down the long hallway, her footsteps echoing off the polished floor. When she reached the room, the bailiff nodded and opened the door. Judge Everett Daniels was seated at the large wooden table, flipping through a thin folder. His reading glasses rested on the bridge of his nose. He looked up when Brooke entered, gesturing for her to sit across from him. The room was empty, save for the two of them. "Officer Harrington," Daniels greeted her, his voice steady but not unkind. "Thank you for coming." Brooke nodded, her throat tight. Daniels closed the folder and leaned back slightly. I asked to meet with you because I want to understand something not as a judge, but as someone who has been where you are. You are at a crossroads. Brooke frowned. Where I am. Daniels removed his glasses and placed them on the table. There is a moment in every life where we are forced to reckon with who we are versus who we thought we were, and it often comes in the form of a mistake. His eyes, dark and calm, met hers. Do you know why I became a judge? Brooke shook her head. Daniels's voice softened. When I was 17, I was wrongfully arrested for a robbery I didn't commit. Spent 3 months in juvenile detention while they sorted it out. Brooke's eyes widened in surprise. Daniels continued, It was the longest 3 months of my life. I wasn't afraid of the time itself. I was afraid of what the world believed about me. To them, I was already guilty because of how I looked. When the truth came out, and I was released, I could have been consumed by anger. But something happened that changed my life. He paused, his gaze distant, as if recalling something precious. There was a guard named Officer James Wilson. He noticed me reading law books in the detention library. Instead of mocking me like the others, he encouraged me. He told me that understanding the law was not just about memorizing rules, it was about understanding people. He gave me hope when I didn't believe I deserved it. Brooke listened, captivated despite herself. Daniels leaned forward again. What I'm telling you, Officer Harrington, is that the badge you wear is not a shield from your mistakes. It is a responsibility that carries the weight of every decision you make. The question is, how will you respond when you realize you've gone wrong? Brooke felt her eyes sting, but she held his gaze. What if it's too late? Daniels smiled faintly, almost sadly. It's only too late if you refuse to learn. No one can rewrite the past, but you can choose what comes next. The room fell into silence. Brooke wanted to say something, anything, but she felt like a dam had broken inside her. She had spent so much time defending herself, trying to prove she had done her job right. But now, in the face of Daniel's calm honesty, she could feel the truth she had failed. Daniel stood and gathered the folder. You have a lot to think about. I hope you take the time to really consider what kind of officer you want to be. This profession needs people who seek justice, not control. He nodded to her and left the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Brooke left the courthouse in a daze, the cool rain falling lightly on her shoulders. She wandered down the street, not sure where she was going. When she finally looked up, she found herself in front of the small public library she used to visit as a kid. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The smell of old books and worn carpet was a strange kind of comfort. She walked the aisles aimlessly until she reached the law section. She pulled out a thin, battered book titled Understanding Civil Rights Cases and took a seat near the window. As she read, time seemed to slow. The stories in the book were not just legal jargon. They were stories of real people, like Justin Matthews, who had been at the mercy of decisions made by others. The more she read, the more the weight in her chest grew. An older man with silver hair sat nearby, reading a thick novel. He noticed her pained expression and offered her a small smile. "Heavy reading for a rainy day," he said lightly. Brooke managed a weak smile. "Yeah, but it feels important," he nodded. "That's how change starts, by deciding something matters enough to face it head on." Brooke closed the book and sat in silence for a moment. The man's words echoed Daniel's in their simplicity. It's only too late if you refuse to learn. When she finally returned to her apartment that evening, Brooke opened her laptop and clicked on the news article that showed Justin Matthews' press conference. She listened carefully as he spoke. "My family and I don't want revenge," Justin said. "We want accountability. We want to feel safe. We want people to be treated like people, not threats." Brooke closed the laptop and sat in the darkened room, her thoughts swirling. She realized that her next step would define her not just as an officer, but as a person. For the first time, Brooke allowed herself to whisper the words she had been avoiding. I was wrong. The words were heavy, but they were also freeing. Judge Daniels had given her something she did not know she needed permission to change. She sat up straighter, a small ember of resolve sparking in her heart. Maybe it was not too late after all. The morning after her conversation with Judge Daniels, Brooke Harrington felt something she had not felt in days: clarity. But clarity did not erase fear. As she stood by her apartment window, watching the city wake up, she knew that today would change everything. She had been wrong, and now she had to face the fallout. Her phone buzzed an official notification from the department. Administrative leave formally extended pending full investigation. The words stared back at her like a sentence handed down from a judge. She took a breath and got dressed, choosing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her uniform. The badge she once wore proudly now sat untouched on the table. As she grabbed her keys, her heart felt heavy with the weight of what was ahead. When Brooke arrived at the precinct, the hum of the morning shift was in full swing. Conversations quieted as she walked through the room. Her colleagues gave her wary glances, their eyes filled with questions and judgment. The one familiar face was Sergeant Grant Foster, who watched her with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Lieutenant Rachel Monroe appeared by the door to her office and gestured for Brooke to come inside. Brooke closed the door behind her and sat down. Monroe's expression was unreadable as she handed Brooke a thick folder. The final report from Internal Affairs, she said. You should see it before the press does. Brooke's stomach twisted as she opened the folder. The report detailed her arrest of Justin Matthews, comparing the facts with the body cam footage, the bystander recordings, and witness statements. The narrative she had written in her original report was dissected line by line. The discrepancies were laid bare. Monroe's voice was calm but firm. The footage doesn't support your claims. Your description of Justin's behavior as erratic doesn't match what actually happened. The report is recommending disciplinary action. Brooke's hands shook slightly as she closed the folder. What happens now? Monroe's eyes softened. The city is announcing a formal apology to Justin Matthews today. His attorney, Marcus Walker, has also filed a civil suit. There will be a press conference at noon. Brooke's heart sank. She felt the floor shifting beneath her, the walls closing in. So that's it? My career is over? Monroe's voice held no anger, only honesty. That's up to you. You've made mistakes, Harrington big ones. But the question isn't whether you can go back. The question is, what are you going to do moving forward? Brooke bit her lip, fighting back tears. She knew that Monroe was not trying to comfort her. She was trying to remind her that there was still a choice to be made. At noon, Brooke sat alone in her apartment watching the live press conference. Angela Matthews stood at the podium, her composure steady but emotional. Justin was by her side, his expression quiet but strong. Angela spoke clearly. We are not here to destroy lives. We are here to ask for accountability not just for my son, but for every family who has lived with the fear that one day their loved one might be treated like a threat instead of a person. Marcus Walker stepped forward next. Today, we are filing a civil suit against the city for wrongful arrest and emotional distress. But this isn't just about financial compensation. This is about change. It is about acknowledging what went wrong and taking steps to ensure it does not happen again. The reporter's questions came fast and relentless, but Justin's family held their ground with dignity. Brooke felt a pang of shame as she watched. Every word was a reminder of how much damage had been done. Her phone buzzed with a call from Sergeant Foster. She hesitated before answering. You watching the press conference? Foster's familiar voice asked. Yeah, Brooke said softly. Foster paused for a moment. You should know something. There are rumors that the city wants to settle this quickly. They don't want this to drag out in court. Brooke's brow furrowed. Settle? without addressing the real issues? That's how these things usually go, Foster replied, unless someone steps forward to tell the truth. Brooke felt the meaning behind his words. The truth, the full truth. The next morning, Brooke found herself standing outside the law offices of Marcus Walker. She had rehearsed her words 100 times on the drive over, but still felt unprepared. The receptionist greeted her with a wary look. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Brooke admitted, "but I need to speak to Mr. Walker. It's important." Moments later, Marcus Walker stepped into the reception area, his expression unreadable. "Officer Harrington." Brooke straightened. "I'm here to tell you that I'm ready to testify in the civil case, about everything." Walker crossed his arms. "Everything?" Brooke nodded. "The way I was trained. The way reports were worded to justify escalation. All of it." Walker studied her carefully. "Why now?" Brooke's voice softened. "Because I have spent too much time being afraid of what the truth will cost me. But now I know what it's already cost Justin and his family. I was wrong, and if there's any way to help make things right, I want to do it." Walker's hardened expression eased slightly. "You're not going to be popular for this." "I don't care," Brooke said quietly. "I care about the truth." When the civil trial began a few weeks later, the courtroom was filled with reporters and members of the community eager to see how the case would unfold. Marcus Walker stood confidently as he laid out the facts of the case. When Brooke took the stand, the room was silent. She could feel every pair of eyes on her as she raised her hand and swore to tell the truth. Walker approached. "Officer Harrington, can you describe the training you received when it came to reporting interactions with civilians?" Brooke inhaled slowly. "We were taught to use language that framed civilians as the aggressors. Words like erratic, non-compliant, and resisting were emphasized because they justified stronger measures, even when they didn't fit the situation." A murmur rippled through the room. Walker's voice was steady. "And did you follow those instructions in your report about Justin Matthews?" Brooke's voice trembled but remained clear. "Yes, I did." "Why?" Brooke met his gaze. "Because I thought authority meant being in control. But I realize now that real authority means understanding the people you serve and being accountable for your actions. I failed at that, and it cost Justin and his family more than I can imagine." In the front row, Angela Matthews held her son's hand tightly. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded just once as if acknowledging the weight of Brooke's words. The fall had been inevitable, but for the first time, Brooke felt like she was standing on something solid truth. She was no longer running from what she had done. She was facing it head-on. Brooke Harrington stepped down from the witness stand, her heart still pounding as she returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent, but it was the heavy kind of silence, the kind that carries the weight of everything unsaid. Marcus Walker stood at the prosecution's table, his voice steady as he called the next witness. "The defense calls Dr. Evelyn Marshall, expert in police training and behavioral psychology." A woman in her early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a calm presence took the stand. Dr. Marshall's reputation preceded her. She had spent decades studying the effects of law enforcement training on decision-making and bias. As she was sworn in, Brooke's eyes remained fixed on her. She knew this part of the case would be damning not because of personal attacks, but because Dr. Marshall would break everything down in a way that made it impossible to ignore. "Dr. Marshall," Marcus began, "you've reviewed Officer Harrington's training records, her reports, and the footage of the incident involving Justin Matthews. Can you explain what you found?" Dr. Marshall folded her hands thoughtfully. "Yes. Officer Harrington's actions reflect a larger issue rooted in training practices that emphasize control over connection. The use of vague terms like suspicious and uncooperative in reports is often taught to create justification for escalation, even when none is necessary. This is not unique to Officer Harrington. It's a systemic issue. Brooke felt a sharp pang in her chest. She had known Dr. Marshall's testimony would reflect poorly on her, but hearing it spoken aloud was like standing in front of a mirror and seeing the truth with brutal clarity. Marcus nodded. And in your professional opinion, did Officer Harrington's training prepare her to approach situations with objectivity? Dr. Marshall's answer was measured but unwavering. No. Her training reinforced biases rather than challenged them. Officers like Harrington are taught to look for threats instead of people. When that becomes instinctual, mistakes are inevitable. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Brooke clenched her hands in her lap, forcing herself to sit still, even as the truth pierced through her defenses. Marcus continued. Can this type of training be changed? Absolutely, Dr. Marshall replied. Officers can be taught to approach situations with empathy and de-escalation techniques, but that requires systemic changes, honest accountability, and a commitment to unlearning harmful practices. When the court adjourned for the day, Brooke walked out into the fading afternoon light. The streets were crowded with reporters and onlookers, their whispers following her as she made her way past them. She kept walking, her head down, until she reached a nearby park bench shaded by a large oak tree. The city hummed around her, kids playing on the playground, joggers passing by, couples chatting on picnic blankets. But Brooke sat alone, staring at her reflection in the shallow fountain across from her. For years, she had seen herself as someone who was protecting the public. But now, she could not escape the question that had been gnawing at her. Who was I protecting that day? As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard someone approach. She looked up to see Angela Matthews standing a few feet away. Brooke's breath caught in her throat. Angela hesitated before sitting down beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Brooke felt the urge to apologize again, but she didn't know if she had the right words. Angela was the first to break the silence. You know, when Justin was a kid, he loved to read stories about heroes. She gave a small, sad smile. He wanted to believe the world was fair, and I wanted to believe that too. Brooke swallowed hard. I ruined that for him. Angela turned to face her, her expression both weary and resolute. You're right, you did. But it's not just about my son. It's about all the people who didn't get justice, people who didn't have cameras around to tell their story. Brooke nodded slowly, guilt washing over her. I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was following the rules. Angela's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. That's the problem. The rules were wrong, and if people like you don't speak out, they'll stay that way. Brooke felt her throat tighten. She wanted to ask for forgiveness, but she knew it wasn't that simple. I'm trying to make it right, she whispered. Angela let out a quiet breath. Making it right means more than admitting you were wrong. It means showing people what right actually looks like. When Brooke got home, the apartment was still and quiet, but something inside her had shifted. Angela's words had stuck with her. Show people what right looks like. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. Instead of avoiding the footage this time, she played it back and forced herself to watch every second of the encounter. She watched Justin's calm demeanor, his clear explanation. She watched herself step closer, not listening, but commanding. The realization hit her like a wave. I didn't see him. I only saw what I thought he was. Brooke paused the video and leaned back in her chair. The badge on the corner of her desk gleamed in the dim light. The badge she had once thought symbolized power now felt like a reminder of the responsibility she had ignored. She remembered what Judge Daniels had told her, that one officer had changed the course of his life by showing him kindness in a place where it was rare. Brooke had never thought of kindness as a kind of power, but now she understood. The next day, Brooke walked back into the courthouse with a clearer purpose. The whispers and stares no longer mattered. She was not there to defend herself anymore. She was there to tell the truth. During the proceedings, Marcus Walker asked if she was ready to testify again as part of the new investigative report into department practices. Brooke met his gaze and nodded. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready." When she took the stand, her voice was steady. "The arrest report I filed was misleading. I framed Justin Matthews as aggressive when he wasn't. And I did that because I was following what I was trained to do to justify my actions instead of questioning my assumptions." The courtroom was silent. The weight of her admission hung in the air. She took a deep breath and continued. "The truth is, I didn't see Justin as a person that day. I saw him as a problem I needed to control. But he wasn't the problem. I was." In the front row, Angela Matthews closed her eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. Brooke couldn't tell what she was thinking, but she knew one thing. This time, she had spoken the truth without fear. As she stepped down from the stand, she felt something shift within her. Not relief, exactly, but something close to it. It wasn't forgiveness or redemption. Not yet. But it was a step in the right direction. The courtroom doors creaked shut behind Brooke Harrington as she stepped into the hallway, the low murmur of conversations following her like distant echoes. The weight of her testimony still lingered in her chest, a strange mix of fear and relief. She had admitted everything. There was no turning back now. Brooke exhaled slowly, pressing her back against the cold wall. Across the hall, Angela Matthews was speaking quietly to Marcus Walker. Justin stood beside them, his gaze distant but calm. Brooke hesitated for a moment, then walked toward them. Angela noticed her approach and gave a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. Brooke stopped a few feet away, unsure of what to say. I just wanted to say thank you," Brooke began, her voice low. "For listening, for your patience. You didn't have to." Angela's eyes softened, though her face remained composed. "I listened because I needed to know if you'd finally understand what you took from us. It wasn't just about Justin being handcuffed. You took away our sense of safety, our belief that he could just live his life without being treated like a threat." Brooke swallowed hard. "I know, and I'm sorry." She paused, then added, "I want to do more than apologize. I'm willing to speak openly about the way I was trained, about the mistakes that led to this." Marcus Walker crossed his arms, his expression cautious but intrigued. "You're saying you're willing to testify beyond this case? To take this public?" Brooke nodded. "Yes. If it helps prevent something like this from happening again, I'll do it." Angela exchanged a glance with Marcus before looking back at Brooke. "That's a start." Later that evening, Brooke sat at her apartment's small kitchen table, staring at the open laptop in front of her. The cursor blinked on a blank email draft addressed to the Internal Review Board. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she tried to find the right words. The truth was terrifying. She had spent years convinced that strength came from silence and control. But today, in that courtroom, she had seen the power of honesty. She began typing. "To the Lexington Police Department Review Board, I am writing to offer my full cooperation in the ongoing investigation into systemic issues within the department." The words flowed faster as she described not just what had happened during Justin's arrest, but the culture that shaped her decisions, the language she had been taught to use, the fear of appearing weak, the unspoken expectation that authority could not be questioned. When she finished the email, she hovered over the send button. For a long moment, her hand trembled. But then Angela's words echoed in her mind. "Show people what right looks like." She pressed send. The following week, Brooke met with the Civilian Oversight Committee assembled to address the department's internal failures. The committee was made up of city officials, activists, and community leaders, including Angela Matthews. The meeting took place in a modest conference room at City Hall, far from the public eye but heavy with significance. Brooke sat at the long table, feeling the eyes of the committee on her. She took a deep breath and began. I want to speak honestly about what I saw during my training and how it shaped the way I handled situations, she said. We were taught de-escalation in theory, but in practice, we were encouraged to maintain control at all costs. Control meant dominance, never vulnerability. I absorbed that without question. One of the committee members, a former teacher named Miriam Lee, leaned forward. Why didn't you question it? Brooke's voice faltered for a second, but she recovered. Because I thought questioning meant weakness. I thought strength meant always being right. But I see now that true strength means admitting when you've been wrong. Angela Matthews listened intently, her expression unreadable. But Brooke didn't speak for approval. She spoke because she needed to. The questions from the committee continued for over an hour, each one probing deeper. Some were harsh, but Brooke answered everyone. When the meeting ended, she felt drained, but resolute. That afternoon, Brooke stopped by a small coffee shop near City Hall. As she waited for her order, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned and saw Sergeant Grant Foster standing there, holding his own cup of coffee. Didn't expect to see you here, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Brooke offered a faint smile. I could say the same. Foster nodded toward a nearby table. Mind if I join you? She shook her head and followed him to the table. They sat across from each other in the quiet corner of the shop. Foster stirred his coffee absently. Word travels fast, you know. People are talking about what you did at the committee meeting. Brooke braced herself. I'm sure it wasn't all good. Foster chuckled. No, it wasn't. Some people are furious, but there are others who respect what you're doing, who know how hard it is to admit you were wrong. Brooke looked down at her cup. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like catching up to something I should have realized sooner. Foster's expression softened. Maybe, but it's still brave, and it matters. They sat in silence for a few moments before Foster spoke again. I've been in this job long enough to know that the system doesn't change unless people are willing to speak up. You've got a long road ahead, Harrington, but if you're serious about making this right, I'll back you. Brooke's chest tightened with unexpected gratitude. Thank you, Sarge. He nodded once and stood to leave. One step at a time, he said over his shoulder. That night, Brooke walked home under the soft glow of the city lights. She passed familiar streets, but noticed things she had never paid attention to before: the groups of teenagers laughing outside a corner store, the elderly man who waved to passers-by from his porch. They weren't just scenes anymore. They were people with lives, stories, and families. She thought about Justin's words during the trial. We just want to feel safe. For the first time, Brooke truly understood. The next morning, Marcus Walker called her. There's going to be a public forum in a few days about police accountability, he said. The community wants answers, and they need to see that there are people within the system who want change. Brooke paused, but only for a moment. I'll be there, she said. She hung up the phone and took a deep breath. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a quiet, steady resolve. She knew there was still a long journey ahead, one filled with difficult conversations, uncomfortable truths, and more moments of doubt. But she also knew that healing didn't happen overnight. It happened one step, one honest word, at a time. And Brooke was ready to walk that path. The community forum was held in the city's largest civic center, a space that had seen everything from graduations to protests. Tonight, it was filled with people whose faces reflected anger, grief, hope, and skepticism. The room buzzed with conversation as members of the community, activists, city officials, and police officers filed in. Brooke Harrington sat near the back, feeling the weight of every eye that landed on her. She was dressed simply, no uniform or badge, just herself. Even without the formalities of the courtroom, the stakes felt just as high. She knew why she was here. not to defend herself, but to listen and take accountability. The room quieted as Angela Matthews stepped to the podium. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, and when she spoke, the entire room seemed to lean forward. "Good evening," Angela began, her voice clear but calm. "Thank you for being here. We gathered tonight because something happened in this city that cannot be ignored. But this is not just about my son, Justin. It is about the experiences that many in our community live through, but rarely have the chance to speak about." The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffling of papers or a cough from the back row. Angela's gaze swept over the crowd. "Before we continue, I want you all to hear from the person whose voice has been at the center of this, the person whose strength brought us all here tonight." She turned and gestured for Justin to approach the microphone. Brooke felt her breath catch as Justin Matthews walked up to the podium, standing tall but humble. His presence commanded the room, but not because of anger or bravado. It was the quiet resilience in his eyes. Justin adjusted the microphone and began. "My name is Justin Matthews, and I am here tonight because I want to share what happened, not for sympathy, but for change." His voice was steady, but Brooke could hear the emotion beneath it. "The day I was arrested, I wasn't doing anything special. I wasn't protesting or causing a scene. I was standing outside a store, waiting to have lunch with my sister, like I did every Thursday. And yet, in that moment, I became someone else in the eyes of the person who approached me. I became a threat." Justin's eyes swept the room. "I've been asked how I stayed calm, how I kept from getting angry. But I wasn't calm because I wasn't affected. I was calm because I knew that my survival might depend on it. And still, it wasn't enough." Brooke felt a tightness in her chest as Justin continued. He wasn't embellishing or dramatizing, he was telling the simple truth. "What happened that day changed me. I didn't just lose my sense of safety, I lost trust in the idea that I could live my life without suspicion. And it hurt, not just for me, but for my family. My mother had to watch me be handcuffed and taken away. My sister, who was just a few feet away, couldn't stop it." The room was still as Justin paused. He took a slow breath before speaking again. "But I didn't come here to tell you what you already know. I came here to tell you that I want better not just for me, but for this entire city. We shouldn't have to live with fear. No one should." The audience erupted into applause, some slow and somber, others loud and impassioned. Justin nodded, stepping back from the podium. Brooke watched him walk back to his seat, his mother wrapping an arm around his shoulders. She could feel the power of his words reverberating through the room. After Justin spoke, Marcus Walker took the stage to outline the broader demands for change, transparent investigations, stronger accountability measures, and independent civilian oversight. The crowd responded with nods of agreement and quiet murmurs. Then, Marcus called Brooke's name. Her heart thudded in her chest as she rose to her feet and made her way to the front. The room shifted again, whispers rising like a low wave. Some people leaned in, others folded their arms, watching her with guarded eyes. Brooke stepped up to the microphone, her hands gripping the sides of the podium. For a brief moment, she felt the familiar surge of panic, but then she remembered why she was here, not to defend herself, but to speak the truth. "My name is Brooke Harrington," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "I was the officer who arrested Justin Matthews that day, and I need you to know that I was wrong." A hush fell over the crowd. Brooke felt the intensity of their stares, but she kept going. "I didn't see Justin for who he was. I only saw what I was trained to see, a threat where there wasn't one. And because of that, I caused harm that I can't take back. But I can't stand here and make excuses. I'm here to take responsibility and to be part of the change that should have happened a long time ago." She took a breath and looked toward Justin and Angela. "The truth is, I didn't just fail Justin and his family, I failed the community I swore to serve." The room was silent, but the tension began to shift. Brooke met the eyes of people in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, and some just tired. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Brooke continued. "That's not something I can demand or expect. But I'm here because I want to help rebuild trust. I've started working with the Oversight Board to share everything I know, how we were trained, where things went wrong, and how we can fix them. I know that words aren't enough, but I'm ready to do the work." She paused, feeling the weight of the moment. This isn't about one case or one officer. This is about building something better, a system where no one feels like they have to prove they belong. I want to be part of that change, no matter how long it takes. Brooke stepped back from the podium. There was no applause, just a deep, heavy silence. She didn't expect praise, and she didn't need it. She returned to her seat, feeling lighter simply because she had spoken the truth. As the forum concluded, small groups of people stayed behind to talk. Some approached Marcus Walker to ask about next steps. Others lingered near Justin and Angela, offering quiet words of support. Brooke sat quietly in her chair, watching from a distance. She knew she still had a long way to go. The damage she had caused couldn't be undone by one speech. But she also knew that change started with moments like this, small, honest moments. She looked up when Justin approached her, his expression thoughtful. "That took guts," he said simply. Brooke nodded. "I owe you and your family more than words." Justin studied her for a moment before offering a small but genuine nod. "Then keep doing the work." Brooke felt something shift, not forgiveness, but the beginning of understanding. As she left the Civic Center and stepped out into the cool night air, Brooke thought about how much her life had changed since that day at the corner store. She had lost the version of herself she thought she was, but, in its place, she was starting to build something stronger. In the quiet of the night, she whispered the words she needed to hold on to. Keep doing the work, and she would. The morning after the forum, Brooke Harrington woke to the soft hum of traffic outside her apartment window. The city was already moving, but for the first time in weeks, Brooke didn't feel paralyzed by the thought of what the day would bring. She stretched, feeling the unfamiliar weight of hope pressing against the constant doubt she had carried. She had spoken her truth. Now came the harder part, proving that her words weren't just empty promises. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with a message from Lieutenant Rachel Monroe. "Meeting today at Precinct HQ. Be there at 10 a.m. Brooke stared at the screen, unsure if this was a step forward or another consequence waiting to unfold. Either way, she knew she had to face it. By the time Brooke reached the precinct, the air was buzzing with quiet tension. Officers moved through the halls, some glancing at her with curiosity, others with something colder, resentment. Lieutenant Monroe was already waiting for her in the conference room, sitting at the long table with Sergeant Foster and two members of the Internal Review Board. Monroe's expression was unreadable, but Foster gave Brooke a small nod of reassurance. "Take a seat," Monroe said. Brooke pulled out the chair and sat down, clasping her hands together to steady them. The head of the review board, a stern-looking man named Eric Carlson, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Officer Harrington, we've reviewed your testimony, your cooperation with the Oversight Committee, and your conduct during the investigation. Your willingness to speak openly is noted, but that doesn't absolve you of responsibility." Brooke nodded. "I understand." Carlson's gaze was sharp. "The department has decided to move forward with disciplinary measures. You will be officially suspended without pay for 6 months. Brooke's chest tightened, but she kept her face steady. She had expected this. Carlson continued, "However, given your cooperation, the board is also recommending that you undergo specialized training and assist in developing new protocols for de-escalation and report writing. If you complete these successfully, your record will be amended to reflect your work toward reform." Brooke's breath caught. This wasn't just a punishment, it was a chance to rebuild. Monroe leaned forward, her voice softer than usual. "This is a rare opportunity, Harrington. We're giving you a chance because you've shown that you're serious about making things right. But you need to understand, this won't be easy. You're walking into a fight, not just against the system, but against the people who still believe the system doesn't need to change. Brooke met her gaze, resolve settling into her bones. I'm ready. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of Brooke's life. Her days were filled with workshops on community relations, lectures from civil rights advocates, and late-night meetings with members of the Civilian Review Board. Each day forced her to confront the mistakes she had made and the assumptions she had carried with her. Some sessions felt overwhelming, particularly the one where civilians shared their personal stories of wrongful stops, arrests, and humiliations. One man, an older mechanic named Ron Davis, recounted being pulled over on his way home from work for no reason other than looking out of place. "You know what hurt the most?" Ron said, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't the stop itself. It was the look in that officer's eyes. Like I didn't belong. Like I wasn't worth the respect he'd give anyone else." Brooke felt tears sting her eyes but kept them from falling. She didn't speak during the session. She just listened, because listening was part of the work. One evening after a particularly difficult training session, Brooke walked out into the parking lot and was surprised to see Marcus Walker leaning against his car, waiting for her. "Walker?" Brooke said, adjusting her bag. "What are you doing here?" Marcus shrugged. "Heard you've been working with the board. Thought I'd see how you're holding up." Brooke gave a small, tired smile. "It's hard, but it's worth it." Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You know, I was skeptical at first, thought maybe you'd only come forward to save yourself. But I've seen what you've been doing. I think you're proving me wrong." Brooke's smile grew a little wider. "I'm okay with that." Marcus's expression turned serious. "There's a long road ahead. You're still going to face people who think you're just trying to clean up your image. Some of them won't believe you've really changed." "I know," Brooke said softly. "But this isn't about them. It's about doing what's right." Marcus nodded again and pushed off the car. "Keep at it, Harrington. We need people inside the system who are willing to break the silence." The next day, Brooke attended a meeting with the department's leadership to present ideas for new de-escalation protocols. The room was filled with senior officers, many of whom had been resistant to the changes being pushed by the oversight board. Brooke stood at the front, her notes in hand. "The goal of these protocols is to focus on communication, listening, and reducing unnecessary escalation. It's about shifting from control to understanding." One of the older captains leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So what you want us to be therapists now?" Brooke met his gaze calmly. "No, I want us to be public servants. That's what we signed up for. And serving the public means protecting everyone, not just the people who look like us, or act the way we expect." There was a murmur of agreement from some of the officers in the room, but others remained silent. Lieutenant Monroe, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "These changes aren't about weakness. They're about rebuilding trust with the community. And if we're not willing to do that, then we're not doing our jobs." The room fell quiet again. Brooke felt a flicker of hope, small but steady. Later that evening, Brooke walked through her old neighborhood, the streets quiet under the dim glow of streetlights. She passed the corner store where Justin's arrest had taken place. The memory felt sharper now, but it didn't overwhelm her, it grounded her. As she stood there, the door to the store opened, and Devin Matthews, Justin's cousin, stepped out, holding a bag of snacks. He noticed Brooke and paused, his expression wary, but not hostile. "Hey," Brooke said, her voice soft. Devin shifted on his feet. "You're still out here doing this?" Brooke nodded. "Yeah, I am." Devin studied her for a long moment before finally giving a small nod. "Good." He didn't say anything else as he walked away, but Brooke felt the shift in that brief exchange. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, a recognition that she was still trying. As she walked home, Brooke thought about all the people she had listened to in those training sessions, all the pain she had heard. She couldn't change what had happened to them, but she could change how she moved forward. Keep doing the work. The words stayed with her, guiding her through the darkness like a steady flame. The morning sun rose quietly over the city, spilling gold light over the rooftops and streets. Brooke Harrington stood in front of her mirror, smoothing the collar of her shirt. Her reflection stared back calmer, steadier than she remembered. Today was her first official day back at the precinct after 6 months of suspension and training. She took a deep breath, grabbed her keys, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. As she walked down the street, she passed familiar places: the coffee shop, the park, the corner store where everything had started. The weight of those memories felt lighter now. The past still lived in her mind, but it no longer controlled her. At the precinct, the hum of conversations greeted her as she walked in. Some officers glanced her way with curiosity, others with silent disapproval. Brooke had expected that. She wasn't here to be liked, she was here to do the work. Lieutenant Monroe was standing near the briefing room. She caught Brooke's eye and gave a small nod. Brooke nodded back, grateful for the quiet support. "Roll call in 5 minutes," Sergeant Foster called out from the front. His voice was familiar, grounding. Brooke took her place in the room, sitting in the same chair she used to sit in. But everything felt different now. The room filled quickly as officers shuffled in and took their seats. Conversation slowed as Foster cleared his throat. "Before we get into today's assignments, I want to make an announcement," Foster began. "Officer Harrington is back after completing her suspension and extensive training with the Civilian Oversight Board. She's here because she chose to take responsibility, to learn, and to do better. And that's what this job should be about." A few officers exchanged glances, some skeptical, some thoughtful. Foster continued, "If any of you have concerns about what change means for this department, I suggest you speak with Officer Harrington. She's not here to lecture anyone, she's here to help rebuild something stronger." The room was silent for a moment before Foster nodded toward Brooke. "You want to say anything?" Brooke stood, her pulse steady but strong. "I know some of you probably don't trust me yet, and that's fair. I've made mistakes that I can't take back. But I'm here to be part of the solution, not just for the department, but for the people we serve. I'm not asking for anyone's forgiveness. I'm asking for us to remember why we chose this job in the first place." The room remained quiet, but Brooke caught a few nods from the back. Monroe folded her arms and smiled faintly, her approval subtle but unmistakable. After the meeting, Brooke headed out on patrol with her new partner, a rookie named Logan Price. He was young, fresh out of the academy, with an eagerness that reminded Brooke of herself years ago. "First day back, huh?" Logan asked as they drove through their assigned route. "Yeah," Brooke said, glancing at him with a small smile. "Yours too, technically," Logan grinned. "Fair enough. Heard about your case, by the way. It's intense." Brooke nodded. "It was, but it taught me a lot." She hesitated, then added, "The biggest lesson. It's not about controls, it's about understanding. People aren't checkboxes in a report. They're people." Logan absorbed her words, nodding slowly. "Makes sense." The radio crackled with a call. "Unit 312, possible disturbance at Greenfield Park. Caller reports a verbal altercation." Brooke picked up the receiver. "Copy that. Unit 3 to 12 en route." When they arrived at the park, Brooke scanned the scene. 2 men were arguing near a bench, their voices raised but not yet hostile. A small group of bystanders watched nervously. Brooke exchanged a glance with Logan. "Let's stay calm and listen first." They approached slowly, their body language opens rather than confrontational. "Hey," Brooke called out, her tone steady but calm. "What's going on here?" One of the men, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, gestured angrily. "This guy accused me of stealing his phone. I didn't take anything." The other man, younger and agitated, clutched his backpack tightly. "I saw him near my bag. I don't want any trouble, I just want my stuff back." Brooke nodded, keeping her voice even. Okay, let's take a breath. What's your name? The younger man hesitated. Daniel. And yours? She asked the older man. Marcus, he muttered. Okay, Daniel. Marcus, we're going to figure this out. But first, let's step back and give each other some space. Both men hesitated but slowly took a step back. Brooke stayed in the middle, her hands visible, her voice calm. Daniel, have you checked inside your bag? Brooke asked gently. Daniel blinked, then opened the main zipper. After a few seconds of rummaging, his face flushed with embarrassment. He pulled out the missing phone. Oh, it was here the whole time. Marcus folded his arms but didn't speak. Brooke glanced at him. Misunderstandings happen. No harm done. Daniel looked up, clearly embarrassed. I'm sorry, he muttered. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, well, I've had worse accusations thrown at me. Let's just forget it. Brooke gave them both a small smile. Sounds fair, and thanks for keeping things from escalating. The tension in the air seemed to dissolve as both men walked away in opposite directions. Logan let out a slow breath as they returned to the patrol car. That could have gone bad fast, Logan said. Yeah, Brooke agreed, but it didn't. Because sometimes people just need someone to listen. That evening, Brooke returned to her apartment, the hum of the day still settling in her chest. She made a simple dinner and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Walker. Just heard about your first day back. You're on the right track. Keep going. Brooke smiled as she typed a response. Thanks. I will. A second message came through not from Marcus, but from Angela Matthews. It was brief but meaningful. Justin says thank you for what you said at the forum. He wants you to know he's watching, hoping you stay true to your word. Brooke stared at the message for a long moment before replying. I will, always. As the night deepened, Brooke felt the weight of her journey settle around her like a blanket not heavy with guilt, but comforting with purpose. She had taken her first step back, not as the officer she once was, but as someone new, someone better. The past would always be a part of her, but it didn't define her anymore. What mattered now was what came next. Brooke whispered to herself once more, keep doing the work. And as the city outside her window exhaled into the quiet of the night, Brooke Harrington knew she would. As Brooke Harrington sat by her window, the city lights shimmering in the distance, she knew her journey wasn't over. The road ahead would be filled with more challenges, but this time she was ready to face them with honesty, resilience, and a commitment to change. Her story wasn't just about her mistakes, it was about the power of accountability, the courage to listen, and the hope that real justice could be built through compassion and truth. This story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption if they're willing to learn, take responsibility, and do the work to make things right. Thank you for following Brooke's story of resilience, growth, and hope. If you found this story inspiring and want more powerful stories that highlight justice, accountability, and the triumph of kindness, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful stories that inspire change and remind us all that every journey toward justice starts with a single step. We'll see you in the next story.